Welcome to the WOW podcast, where the goal is to motivate, inspire, and share success principles. I'm your host, George Masri. Thanks for joining me once again today. Interviewing Casey Gray, who is a custom home builder based out of Ottawa, Ontario. He specializes in creating energy-efficient homes. He's also a husband and father, and on this I'm here with Casey Gray. Casey, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the show, George. Really appreciate it.
Great. I'd like to start off by asking you a bit about your childhood. So do you want to tell me about where you grew up and a couple things you remember?
Sure. I had an interesting childhood. I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, but they're all half siblings. So my parents have been divorced and remarried about 4 times each.
Wow.
So technically I'm an only child when my parents were together, but they both had kids before and my father had kids after too. So, but all that being said, it was great. So my childhood was, biking back and forth between houses, which was fun. At one house, I was the youngest. I was the baby. My next sibling was almost 9 years older than me. So that was a different. And at the other house, I was the oldest. So I kind of had to change roles from house to house, which I didn't think about much at the time, but I think that has served me quite well in life because it gave me the ability to adapt to different situations, right? No matter what situation am I in. So that actually worked out quite well. And grew up in Ottawa, but there I was about 21. So I went through high school thinking I was going to become an engineer because I like to build stuff. I knew I was good at construction class, but in grade 12, they came in and they started pushing trades. And I'm like, that's what I want to do. I don't want to go to university. I want to go right to the workforce. And after that, I bought my mom's house from her, turned that into a duplex.
Okay. So Casey, you're a father as well. I was reading somewhere on your website that being a father kind of pushed you to, I don't know if it was to take your business more seriously or to excel, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I always say my son is my greatest teacher because he does what I do, not what I say. So if children have any bad habits, typically they've got that from the parents, if that's where they're spending most of their time. So I take responsibility in that, and that's why he's been such a great teacher. But where the business really started to change direction is when we found out we were having our first son. And at that point, when you realize that you're going to have this little person looking up to you, you start to think differently. And you're like, all right, what kind of, legacy, so to speak, do you want to leave behind? How do you want to lead by example? That was what I was thinking. And if I was going to tell this little boy, girl, didn't know his boy at the time, that he or she could be or do whatever they want, I have to be doing the same thing. And then I started to think about, okay, well, if I want to lead by example, what kind of world do I want to leave behind? And how can I do my best to make sure that this world is better than it was when I leave compared to when I showed up? And that's when I started to think differently about construction. That's when I started to explore passive house. And that's when we actually did our first certified passive house for ourselves. And we just never looked back. So we've been doing high performance homes and renovations ever since.
Can you tell us a bit about passive homes?
Yeah, so it's not to be confused with passive solar homes. So you've probably heard of that. So there's, using the sun to help heat your house. There's an actual certification called Passive House. There's Passive House International, and there's Passive House US. So it's one of the most rigorous building standards in the world, but it really focuses on performance and not the products that are being used necessarily. So it focuses on making sure that you have an extremely airtight envelope, that you have the proper insulation levels, and that you're properly ventilating the home mechanically through an ERV system, so fresh air system, so which is ERVs or HRVs depending on where you are, and you're reducing the overall heating and cooling demand on the home, and you have to hit certain targets. So every home gets modeled. So a certified passive house, for example, in California, wouldn't be certified in Ottawa, where we are. It's basically minimum building code where we are, right? Because it's based on where you are in the world, what zone you're in, and that's what the modeling gets done. So it's definitely extreme, especially if you're up north where we are. The least amount of insulation, if you're familiar with like our insulation levels in a house, the least amount we put in any certified house that we've done so far is our 72.5. And we've gone over our 90 to give you an idea. So we're talking like 2-foot thick walls of insulation and understanding building science so it doesn't turn into a bigger problem.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Another thing that I had read a little bit about on your website is net zero homes. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so net zero energy is another certification that's come out in Canada. I know that they're doing other variations of it, but in Canada, we have net zero energy and net zero energy ready. The difference is really whether or not there's solar panels installed yet. And the concept behind that is similar to passive house, but not as extreme. It still focuses on the energy being used by a home. But the way they look at it is they want to make sure that you have the ability to offset all of the energy that you're using throughout a 12-month period. So obviously where we are, you're going to use a lot more heat in the winter. So you don't have as much daylight, or your solar panels might be covered with snow, so you wouldn't produce as much. So in the winter, you're not really offsetting, but if it averages out over the year and you produce more, or in theory, if you produce more, because it's all based on modeling, right? Then you could get a net zero energy certification. I like net zero where we are because it's still a good standard. It's not extreme. And it still incorporates a lot of the same principles. So that's why I like to do it here. I recommend it a lot. Passive house can be quite expensive for certification, and a lot of people don't go for it because of that. Talking $15,000-$20,000 when everything's said and done. And obviously, we're talking about insulation levels that are twice what they are. So if you're building an off-grid home, which is also not to be confused with net zero, it would make sense to go the passive house route because you need to plan for the worst time of the year as opposed to an average over the 12 months.
Do you find that a lot of people are going after that certification, and what would be the benefit? Are there any incentives to go after those two certifications?
So there's not necessarily any monetary incentives. I think in my personal opinion, the incentive is in the fact that you're building a better home, that you're building a healthier home, that you're building a more comfortable home. By default, you end up with a more energy efficient home, which means that you will save money in the long run. That also allows you to go fossil fuel free if you like. A lot of people use fossil fuels where we are because it's a lot cheaper than electricity, but air source heat pump technology has come a long way. It will work in our climate, and it actually is quite energy efficient. So the incentives aren't like government incentives, but I think there's good incentives otherwise to build this way.
Now, what is an air source heat pump?
So an air source heat would be similar to like a heat pump is like an air conditioner, your fridge. That's heat pump technology, right? Your fridge takes the heat the cold from the room and uses that to cool the fridge through a process, and you can look it up, and process through gases in a compressor. And depending on which way you go, it can either produce heat or produce cold. And heat pump would be the same sort of thing. So instead of having like a natural gas furnace with an air conditioner, you could have a cold climate air source heat pump, which would do heating and cooling, but still be set up like a furnace, for example.
Okay, cool. I had no idea that was possible. But you're saying that an air source heat pump is more efficient because it doesn't use fossil fuel to heat the house.
Correct.
So what is it using? It's using hydro,
Yeah, it's using electricity.
using electricity,
So wherever
but the electricity that it's using is being generated from the solar panels, I guess.
it doesn't have to be, right? You can be connected into the grid. So
Mm-hmm.
this is where some of the arguments come up in this world, right? Like, sure, okay, we all need to go get off fossil fuels and go to all electric, right? That's where a lot of the environmentalists are saying, which, yeah, okay, makes sense to some extent, but we have to think about if we need batteries, where the batteries coming from, how are we going to recycle them, how is that going to affect the environment? We also have to think about where the house is located and how that electricity is made. For in Ottawa, a lot of the electricity is made through dams, right? Water dams. So it's actually quite clean, like 80%, I believe, something like that. So if you go with a fossil fuel free home here, even without solar panels, you are getting clean energy for the most part. But that's not everywhere. There's a lot of coal out there still. There's a lot of natural gas power plants. So there's going fossil fuel free doesn't necessarily help the big picture. It might make you feel better, but it goes deeper than that. So that's why I think there's a lot of misleading things out there. I'm not saying that you go one way or the other. To be honest, I'm not an environmental scientist, so I will get into that and what's actually happening. But I can say is that it's usually not as simple for big complex things, especially complex things like the world. It's probably not as simple as just doing one thing. I think there's a lot more moving parts to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess it is definitely a topic that is talked about a lot now in terms of switching over and using the solar energy and that sort of thing. The one thing that I'm always curious about is because it's so much colder here in the wintertime and whatnot, do the homes get enough from the sun to power? Like if you have solar panels, are you getting enough from the sun during the cold months to power the home?
So solar panels alone will not give you what you need. So you need two things. You need to generate the power, and then you need to store the power. So if you build a home that's off grid with solar panels, you also need batteries. And then those batteries need to really have enough power to do all of your heating and hot water in the coldest months. So you need to make sure you're planning for the worst. The majority of the year, you'll have way too much power. So this is where it gets tricky. So typically people are still connected to the grid. And if you connect into the grid with solar panels, you'll feed that power back into the grid. And then here you can do what's called net metering. And it basically offsets your electricity bills. So you will have a payback over time. So that would be the net zero. So over maybe in the winter months, you're not producing enough. But if you look at your average over the 12 months, you could have a net zero because you produced enough electricity with the solar panels on your roof versus the electricity that you use for the demand of your home.
Cool.
And I'll add to that. I still think that going fossil fuel free makes a lot of sense for other reasons, right? If you get away from the environment aspects, because there are carbon taxes, right? So if you're thinking long term and what's going to happen and thinking financially, well, solar panels and going just with one electricity bill could actually save you money in the long run. Here, there's going to be carbon taxes and things will be going up and people will be penalized and so forth, right? So this, to some extent, you're future proofing your house,
right?
And solar panels will get better and better.
Yeah. So when you're saying you feed the power back into the grid during the summer months, do you need to have a separate line set up for that, like a separate hydro line to be able to feed it back, or does it just go back through the same line that's feeding your house?
Yeah, you'll need to have it. It's not a separate line. Your meter would essentially spin both directions, but you do need to convert that. So that it has to be approved. But you can't just go ahead and do something like this, hire your electrician, get it done, or your solar company. You actually have to go through an approval process because the electricity supplier or provider needs to okay it. It's essentially set up to be a on-demand system. You want electricity, you turn on your light, the power's there. You don't have batteries, you don't have to worry about anything. It's just there. So they're always producing electricity because they're not necessarily storing it. And whatever they overproduce, they sell right to the States for like penny just to get some of their money back.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you need to get approval because if they already have too many solar panels or they have too much power coming in already, they might not allow it. Or maybe the grid in that area can't can't accept it, right?
Hmm.
Maybe that grid is full. So there is a process to go through before you actually do it.
Yeah. And do you think that going through that sort of thing would make sense on a rental property? Let's say, or maybe not like on a single family home, but let's say you had a building, let's say you have 8 to 10 units or larger than that. Have you seen anyone convert to solar?
So I haven't, but I was actually looking at that with some partners, and we did put an offer in on a building, and our plan was to do that. And the reason why we backed out is because there was environmental issues that came up when we were going through our due diligence. But when we ran the numbers, where it can make sense is if you rent out your units all inclusive. The more
Mhm.
units, the better.
Yeah.
You turn your roof into a rental unit with solar panels, and you end up reducing your operating costs, right? Which will increase your net operating income.
Mhm.
So that's how you can actually add money to like a commercial building because you're renting it out. They are expecting to pay a certain amount of utilities, but if you can reduce your utility bills, then you end up being ahead and can actually make it quite good on the financial side.
Yeah. And can anything be done for water in that same example? If you have a building, an apartment building, and you want to reduce the water usage or anything of that sort?
So water usage gets a little trickier. What you can do with solar panels actually is you can have hot water tanks and kind of use those as batteries
Yeah.
as storage, right? Because if you just think of a battery as somewhere to store energy, if your solar panels just go directly into a hot water tank and that electricity kind of preheats some water that goes into the actual hot water tanks, you can save on energy costs that way.
Hmm.
Now, an actual reducing water consumption, that's going to be like low flow fixtures and toilets and
Yeah.
so forth. The only other thing would be like a gray water system, which we've never had to do on any pro. We've looked into it, but a lot of it changes. It's literally get like looks like dirty water
Hmm.
that would go into your toilet. So a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah.
So that gets a little bit trickier when it comes to that end.
What about collecting rainwater and using that? Is that an option?
Yeah, you can use that for your irrigation system, but typically you're not running that through anything in the house.
Okay. Okay. All right. Another thing that I read about a little bit was that you're in some of your projects you're using R70 insulation. So what
Those,
is sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, those would be the passive house projects that I'd mentioned before,
Yeah.
right? That was the least amount.
So is that just like a more dense insulation? Is that is that pretty much what it is?
That would just be layers of insulation. On that particular house, uh, it was a double stud wall. So we had exterior insulation to get rid of thermal bridges. Then we had insulation in our structural wall. And then we framed another wall inside of that structural wall to just hold insulation. So there was wall between those, or sorry, insulation between those two walls, and then more insulation on the outside. So it's typically not just one thing. You can do like dense pack insulation, or you can get big blocks of foam to go underneath buildings to do a lot all at once. But in a wall assembly, you have to think about moisture and how it's going to travel through the wall. So, and how you're going to build it, right? So we usually do some sort of layered insulation, and it's going to vary on the project and the wall assembly that the client wants to go with. So
Yeah.
forth, everything we do is custom, right? So it depends on what the goals of the client are and what their budget is, right? So I like to use rock wool, which used to be called Roxol, which is like a mineral wool because it's naturally fire retardant, and if it gets wet, it doesn't lose its R value, and mold doesn't grow on it. So to me, it's kind of like an added insurance policy in your walls.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I who would have known there'd be so much to know about insulation, but that so I guess just on a very basic level, the for those that may not know, the insulation basically will prevent heat as much heat coming in during the summer months, and then um it'll prevent the cold from entering in the winter months, basically. So it helps you have a more level temperature in the house, correct?
Yes and no. There's more to it than just the insulation. So I'll try and give you building science 101 in couple minutes here. So which is I think it's really important, especially for investors out there, right? You got to make sure you're hiring people who know what they're doing. And if you want to protect your investment, the envelope you want to make sure is done properly. And if you want clients, your tenants to stay, if you can build a healthier building, so when you walk into it, it smells fresh instead of mildewy and moldy, then you'll have better tenants that are willing to pay more and that want to stay longer. So if you think of the envelope of a building, think of it like the skin of your body. Like you want, or if you're thinking of a whole building, right? You want your building to be able to breathe, first of all, but you don't want to breathe through your skin, right? So you breathe through your lungs, and usually you breathe through your nose, and you kind of filter it. Your nose hairs filter the dirt, and then you breathe out, right? You get rid of the stuff you don't need. We want a fresh air system in a building to do that, right? So we want it to come, instead of having leaky walls where all the air's flowing through, you want it to go through a mechanical system that gets preconditioned. So they're simple. I advocate ERVs where we are, enthalpy recovery ventilators or energy recovery ventilators, which allow moisture to travel through the core as well. But without getting into too much detail on that, essentially, as air comes through one way, there's air leaving at the same speed going the other direction, and the air doesn't mix. It goes through a core, which allows the heat or cold to be transferred from one side to the other. So if it's minus 20 outside Celsius and it's plus 20 inside, that minus 20-degree air will be preconditioned by the 20-degree air as it's leaving, but not actually use any sort of heat source. So you don't, if you think of like turning on a bathroom fan or a kitchen range hood, and that's venting outside, and if it's minus 28 degrees outside, when you turn that on, that air has to come in through somewhere. So you're essentially sucking in minus 20-degree air through all the leaky spots in your house. So we want to make sure that you have good lungs for your house, just like for your body. Now your skin, the envelope, is kind of like where you keep the moisture out. You don't want to breathe through your skin, right? That would be like breathing through the walls of your house. You want to control that otherwise, but you do want to be able to perspire through your skin. So you want moisture to be able to travel through it if need be. So that's why you want your wall to be permeable so that moisture can travel in both directions, ideally. And then you want to make sure, as part of that, make sure it's airtight. So if you think of a jacket, and that comes back to like, you don't want your walls to breathe. If you think of like a big winter down jacket, if you have that jacket and you're wearing it and it's unzipped and you face the wind, it doesn't matter how much insulation you have, right? It's open. So the insulation's really not doing anything. But if you zip it up, then you're good to go. So you need the insulation does its job if it has a good air barrier. If you don't have an air barrier, the wind can still whip through there. It's going to help, but it's not going to be as good as having that kind of windbreaker with the insulation as well.
Cool. Okay. So that's a bit of a breakdown of how insulation works, much more detailed than my explanation, but thank you for sharing that. So we did talk about a couple things here that you've been involved in. Do you feel like there's any final things that we should discuss? Anything important that we may have missed?
In terms of construction, I think we kind of tackled the high level stuff. We're going vacation rental route now, which is a little bit different world. We've got a property in Costa Rica now. We're looking into Mexico, so I'll be there soon, checking some things out. And who knows, maybe building down there sometime. We'll find out, but lots of exciting things happening.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm actually going to be going to Costa Rica in November to potentially check out some rental properties there, or vacation rentals, I should say. So,
nice.
We're excited about that. Okay, well, thank you very much for sharing all this. Do you want to just tell us what services, well, it's pretty obvious, but what services you can provide and in what region, and then how the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so we have a few things in the go. Our construction is in Ottawa. So if you're in Ottawa, Canada, then we can definitely help you on that front. But we do have the Conscious Builder Academy too, where we're helping other contractors build better homes. And we have some groups shortly as well. We're working on putting those together, doing a pilot group right now. And we also have our podcast and our YouTube channel, which is everything's the Conscious Builder, and where we obviously have a ton of free content for anybody who just wants to check out what's happening in our world and what we're building and the interesting people we're talking to as well. The best way to get a hold of us would really be through I guess any of our social medias, but through our website or through any of our social media. We're watching everything, so
Cool.
we'll get back to you.
Sounds good. Casey, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll be sure to include your information in the show notes. And I look forward to speaking again in the future. Thanks for listening to this episode. Your support is truly appreciated. And if you can share this with a friend or family member that might benefit from the information, remember, our goal is to motivate and inspire others to take action and to build wealth and to become well off. Enjoy the rest of your day.